The hum of the old Denver apartment building was a constant, low thrum against the backdrop of my determined silence. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 34 years old, residing in a corner of this vibrant city that usually buzzes with energy. But for me, lately, it has been a crucible of focused intent. My small apartment, normally a cozy refuge, had transformed into an operations center. Stacks of documents, legal pads filled with meticulous notes, and a worn laptop occupied every available surface. The faint scent of stale coffee mingled with the dry, crisp air filtering in from the open window, a reminder of the Colorado sky that stretched endlessly above. A year ago, I brought State Farm to its knees, or at least, made them squirm in front of an online audience of hundreds of thousands. I had exposed their shady practice of using what I called fake comps, manipulated comparative estimates, to lowball insurance payouts, a systemic fraud that seemed to be an open secret among industry insiders. The story, a raw, unflinching account of my personal battle, had blown up, as the internet likes to say. 220,000 views and counting, a 98.2% upvote ratio with over 1,100 upvotes, 175 comments, 290 shares, and 2 awards. It was a digital roar of approval, a collective gasp of outrage. I had turned their quiet misconduct into a scandal, just as I'd planned, but that was just the beginning. Most people, once a regulator shrugs off misconduct, assume that's the end of the road. They think you hit a brick wall, accept defeat, and move on. They couldn't be more wrong. That initial dismissal, that casual, infuriating comment from a state insurance regulator, "Oh, all companies do this, Ms. Carter," had ignited a fire in me that even a blizzard couldn't extinguish. It became the genesis of what I now call the Arrington Method, a systematic approach to fighting entrenched corruption, born from a single car accident in New Mexico that should have been a simple claim, but instead unmasked a sprawling system of fraud. That accident, a minor fender bender in Albuquerque, had been the innocuous pebble that started an avalanche. When State Farm offered me a ridiculously low settlement for the damage to my vehicle, citing comparable market values that didn't exist in reality, my internal alarm bells began to clang. I was a detail-oriented person by nature, and something felt off. I started digging, and what I found wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern. A deliberate, calculated scheme to shortchange policyholders. The regulator's dismissive response was the final piece of the puzzle, confirming that this wasn't an isolated incident, but an accepted, even sanctioned, standard practice. That fight, born of frustration and a deep-seated sense of injustice, became my life's mission. It forced me to devise the Arrington Method, a three-pronged attack against corporate malfeasance and regulatory apathy. First, document everything. No phone calls ever. Only paper trails, emails, certified letters, anything that left a tangible, undeniable record. Second, force process. I learned to cite their own statutes, their own regulations, their own bureaucratic rulebooks back at them, using their tools against them, forcing them to follow their own laws or expose their noncompliance. And third, go public. Turn silence into scandal. Because when the spotlight shines, the cockroaches scatter, or at least they become visible. This time, I had escalated. I wasn't just writing a scathing article. I was taking them to court. State Farm, the corporate giant, versus Evelyn Carter, the lone woman from Denver with a stack of documents and an unshakable belief in justice. And here was the kicker, the delicious irony that fueled my early morning research sessions and late-night filings. The same regulator who had told me, so casually, that all companies do this, was now under a $471,000 investigation. That investigation, a direct consequence of the public pressure my last exposé had generated, was looking into the misuse of the very fraud fund meant to protect us, the policyholders, from fraud in the first place. The irony was palpable, a bitter aftertaste that spurred me onward. The initial court filing felt like dropping a stone into a deep well. A tiny plop, barely noticeable, yet I knew the ripples would eventually reach the surface. The filing fees themselves, a paltry $135, felt like a slap in the face. Should citizens really have to pay filing fees to make regulators follow their own laws? It was a question that echoed in the back of my mind, a testament to the brokenness of the system I was fighting. Yet, it was a necessary step. It forced judicial review, pulling the case out of the shadows of bureaucratic indifference and into the light of the legal system. The first few months of the lawsuit were a test of endurance, a gauntlet of legal maneuvers designed to wear down the opposition. State Farm's legal team was formidable, a phalanx of polished lawyers with expensive suits and an air of detached superiority. They filed motion after motion, seeking delays, requesting reams of irrelevant documents, trying to bury me in paperwork. Each day felt like slogging through quicksand. My kitchen table, once a place for quiet meals, was now permanently littered with subpoena requests and discovery responses. My mornings began not with coffee and contemplation, but with the daunting task of deciphering legal jargon and strategizing my next move. I found myself becoming intimately familiar with the Denver court system, the labyrinthine corridors, the hushed intensity of the courtrooms, the tired faces of other citizens caught in similar battles. Each time I stepped into the courthouse, I felt a familiar surge of indignation. Why did it have to be this hard? Why did the burden of proof, the fight for basic fairness, fall so heavily on the shoulders of individuals while powerful corporations operated with impunity? There were moments, many of them, when the weight of it all pressed down on me, threatening to crush my resolve. One particularly bleak Tuesday, after a particularly grueling teleconference with State Farm's attorneys, where they had dismissed my evidence as hearsay and unsubstantiated claims, I felt the familiar burn of frustration turn into a dull ache of despair. My personal savings, while not entirely depleted, were steadily shrinking under the relentless assault of legal fees and my inability to focus on anything else. My friends, though supportive, couldn't truly grasp the depth of the commitment, the sheer exhaustion of it. They would offer well-meaning advice, suggesting I let it go or settle for what I could get. But that wasn't me. That was never going to be me. The lowest point came during a period of radio silence from the regulator's office regarding their internal investigation. Weeks turned into months, and despite my persistent inquiries, I received nothing but generic acknowledgments. It felt like they were trying to whitewash the entire affair, to let the initial public outcry die down, and then quietly sweep their own misconduct under the rug. I imagined the $471,000 of taxpayer money being spent not on a genuine investigation, but on a performative show of accountability. The thought gnawed at me, the idea that even after all this, the system would find a way to protect itself, to perpetuate the very fraud it was supposed to prevent. One evening, staring out at the Denver skyline, the city lights shimmering against the dark expanse of the Rocky Mountains, I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. I had put so much of myself into this fight, sacrificing personal relationships, financial stability, even my peace of mind. Was it worth it? Was I just tilting at windmills, a modern-day Don Quixote fighting an invisible, invincible giant? The original article, the one with over 1 million readers and all the accolades, now felt like a distant memory, a fleeting triumph that hadn't truly moved the needle. I felt physically and emotionally drained, my spirit teetering on the edge of surrender. The Arrington method felt less like a powerful tool and more like a desperate, lonely plea in the wilderness. But then, a small spark ignited within me, fueled by the embers of my initial indignation. It wasn't just my story, I reminded myself. It was a model, it was a blueprint. If I gave up, if I allowed them to wear me down, then the method itself would be invalidated. Others would see it, and they would believe that the system was indeed insurmountable. And that, I realized, was unacceptable. The very idea that I would be complicit in the perpetuation of this injustice, even through my own surrender, was enough to pull me back from the brink. I returned to my stacks of documents with renewed, albeit weary, determination. I began compiling a comprehensive dossier, not just of State Farm's actions, but of the regulators in action. I meticulously cross-referenced every email, every official letter, every dismissive phone call summary I had documented. My phone call rule had proven invaluable. Every significant interaction had been followed up with a written confirmation or request, creating an unassailable paper trail. This was the core of document everything. My focus shifted to the force process aspect of the Arrington method. I meticulously went through the Colorado Revised Statutes, the Administrative Procedures Act, and the specific regulations governing the Department of Insurance. I found obscure clauses, deadlines, and internal review processes that the regulator had either ignored or deliberately sidestepped. I prepared a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, detailing not just State Farm's fraud, but the regulatory agency's consistent failure to act and its subsequent, seemingly performative, investigation. Then came the breakthrough, a culmination of months of relentless pressure and unwavering persistence. An email landed in my inbox, unassuming at first glance, but bearing an official seal that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The Department of Justice, the federal oversight, formally requested my evidence. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment where my individual fight transcended state lines and became a matter of federal interest. The sheer volume of public attention my previous article had garnered, the million-plus readers who had become de facto witnesses, had exerted enough pressure to finally draw the attention of a higher authority. It was the go public aspect of the Arrington method coming full circle, turning silence into undeniable scandal. The request from the Department of Justice injected a new energy into my legal team. Essentially, myself and a very patient pro bono lawyer I'd managed to secure early on, who was now seeing the fruits of his initial faith. The dynamics of the lawsuit against State Farm shifted almost immediately. Their lawyers, once dismissive, became noticeably more cautious, their bluster replaced by a quiet calculation. They knew, as did I, that federal oversight changed everything. It wasn't just a disgruntled policyholder anymore. It was the weight of the United States government. The climax arrived not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in a series of tense, high-stakes negotiations facilitated by the Department of Justice. The specter of a federal investigation, potentially leading to widespread charges, hung heavy in the air. State Farm, eager to avoid further public relations nightmares and the immense financial penalties that a federal case could bring, became significantly more amenable to a settlement. My evidence, meticulously documented and now under the scrutiny of federal prosecutors, was irrefutable. The resolution, when it came, was a quiet victory, a testament to the power of persistence and a well-executed strategy. State Farm agreed to a substantial settlement, not just for my individual claim, but for a class of other policyholders who had been similarly defrauded. It was an admission of guilt, cloaked in the language of a mutually agreeable resolution. More importantly, they agreed to review and revise their comparable estimate practices under the oversight of an independent auditor. It wasn't a complete dismantling of their entire system, but it was a crack in their impenetrable facade, a precedent set. And the regulator? The $471,000 investigation, now under federal lens, concluded with a damning report. It detailed systemic failures, improper use of the fraud fund, and a culture of lax oversight. While no specific individual was publicly named and shamed beyond the initial investigation, the agency underwent a significant overhaul, with new leadership brought in and promises of increased transparency and accountability. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a massive step forward, a clear indication that the Arrington method had worked. It had forced the system to acknowledge its flaws and, however reluctantly, begin to correct them. Looking back, the journey had been arduous, fraught with doubt and despair. But seeing the results, knowing that my fight had not only brought a corporate giant to account, but had also spurred a governmental agency to reform itself, filled me with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was, as I'd intended, a model. A blueprint for others who found themselves up against seemingly insurmountable odds. Now, as I sit in my quiet apartment, the stacks of documents reduced to a single, organized folder, I reflect on the long road traveled. The hum of the building still pervades the air, but it no longer feels oppressive. It feels like the background noise of a world where justice, however slow and hard one, is still possible. I often think about that first $135 court filing fee, the small sum that unlocked a cascade of events. And I still wonder, profoundly, should citizens really have to pay filing fees to make regulators follow their own laws? It's a question that echoes in the silence, a reminder that while this battle is won, the war for true accountability is far from over. And I, Evelyn Carter, am ready for part 3.